Well, we're 25% of the way through 2025. What do you have to say for yourself? Hello, welcome or welcome back to Reading from the Devs. My name is Lecta, and thank you so much for spending some time with me today. So today I'm going to look back what I've been up to the back half of March, what books I've read, what's been going on, maybe do a little bit of prognostication about what might be happening in April. So we'll go from there, see how it goes. These last 2 weeks of March have been kind of the last 2 weeks of my holiday. I've had a little bit of an extended holiday, and everything at the monastery is kind of ramping back up, and it's going to be starting again as of April, our normal schedule. And so things are going to get a lot busier. So I've been enjoying my time off, and it just so happens the last couple of weeks, not only did I not have as many monastery obligations, I also didn't have any teaching engagements. So I spent the whole time doing personal translation work and other extracurricular work and reading, really recognizing that my time to read is going to be cut down significantly. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video when I'm looking forward to what's going to be happening in April with my reading and also with the channel. Now, the other big thing that happened to me in March, that kind of revolutionized my reading in some way and made the rest of the year look a little bit more optimistic in some ways. And this is going to be prosaic. I think most of you won't find this revolutionary, but I learned how to enjoy reading audiobooks. And I know, big surprise. I've always said that reading audiobooks is real reading, but I haven't done it a lot. I've read some nonfiction, but reading fiction in audiobook form hasn't really worked for me. I think the last time I've read an audiobook, I don't even remember the book, but it had to be decades ago. And I remember getting like a 6-pack of CDs in the library, and I listened to them in a car ride. And the reason that I don't really read books that way that often is, one, I don't have a commute to work. I don't have the daily activities that many other people have that would afford me like long periods of free time where I could engage in that kind of reading, as opposed where regular reading a physical book or an ebook wouldn't be a substitute. And I listen to a lot of podcasts, mostly about politics and technology, science, and then pop culture, whether it be books, reading, or movies and things like this. And I've gotten used to, when I have things to do around my house, around the monastery, to listening to podcasts. And I can listen to podcasts at like 75% attention and do these other things. And that is adequate for me. But if I'm listening to a book, I want to be 100% attention or close to it. I can't multitask if I'm listening to a book. And so because of that, I just haven't found a lot of benefit to listening to audiobooks. I haven't found a way to do it that feels like I'm being productive and I'm enjoying the book at the same time. And so it's been a struggle for me. So the reason I started doing it, though, was a friend, Carl, had recommended a book, a collection of short stories by James Baldwin that I really wanted to read. And my library had the audiobook available immediately, but if I wanted to get an ebook, I'd have to wait a few weeks because someone else was reading it. So I said, well, I might as well try the audiobook. And I did. And I set some parameters for myself about how I would engage with that book and how I would use that time, like what other tasks I would be doing while reading or tasks I would not be doing. And I had a really great experience. And so because of that, I started looking to what other books I could easily get from my library as audiobooks and use them to supplement some of my reading when, instead of listening to as many podcasts as I listen to, or when I have downtime. And I have been finding a good balance. So I read 4 books in the last 2 weeks through audiobooks. And one thing I found, which was kind of a delight for me, is that one thing I can do while I'm listening to audiobooks is I can knit or do knit work or crochet work. And I've been knitting and crocheting for 3 decades or so. But right now, I don't have a lot of free time to do it. And I'd rather be reading than knitting for the most part. So 90% of the time, if I have to make a choice between doing fiber arts or reading, I'm going to read. But now I actually, depending on what I'm knitting or the particular pattern, I'm able to, I've been working on a sweater for my sister for over a year, and it's just sitting there, like languishing, getting nowhere. But that is something I can do while reading. So it's been really wonderful for me to experience the joy of reading fiction via audiobook, which is something I've been a supporter of for a long time, but I haven't found a way to make it work. And it seems to be working right now, which is really exciting. Also, going forward, as I get busier and busier at the monastery and I have less and less free time and I have to make decisions about how I'm going to use my time, I think including audiobooks as part of my regular reading regimen, I think is going to be useful for me or beneficial for me. I think so, at least. So it seems silly for someone that's been reading so long and reads so often to all of a sudden start reading audiobooks and be so blown away by it. But, that's what happened, and I'm really glad that I discovered it. So with that, let's talk about the books I read the back half of March. ever since my last check-in. I read a decent amount of books, in part because 4 of them were audiobooks. I'm not going to talk about them in the order I read them. I think I'm going to kind of group them a little bit differently. The first 2 books I want to talk about are 2 short story collections that I finished. The first one is called The Future is Female. This is by the Library of America, and it's edited by Lisa Yazek. Now, there are 2 volumes. This is the first volume, and this covers 1928 to 1969. This is a collection of sci-fi short stories written by female authors. And so this is the first one. And as I said, there is a second volume. This, though, I thought was excellent. I didn't really have any expectations. I wasn't sure what I was getting into. And in this collection, there's 24 stories. They're edited or curated chronologically, and they cover the whole range of subgenres of sci-fi, from just kind of mild speculative fiction to like post-apocalyptic and dystopian fiction to intergalactic space operas and everything in between. And what I was really surprised by, not that they were good, I expected that. They were dark. A lot of these stories were really, really dark, like a lot darker than I had expected them to be. Some of them had this kind of, the 1950s, 1960s hope optimism vibe, but others subverted that entirely. And so I had a blast reading this. I think they were all good. Not a single story in here was less than, let's say, 3 stars. Most of them were 4 and 5 stars. If I were to pull out a couple highlights for me, Leslie Perry's Space episode, or That Only a Mother by Judith Merrill. Let's see. Created He Them by Alice Eleanor Jones. That one was really heavy. All the Colors of the Rainbow by Lee Brackett. The Tunnel Ahead by Alex Glaser. And a bunch of others. Like, this was a really great collection. I highly recommend it. And I look forward to reading volume 2, which I will be doing soon, hopefully. Now, the next collection of short stories that I read this month was kind of in celebration of the Celtic Readathon. And this was Celtic Weird, Tales of Wicked Folklore and Dark Mythology. And this is put out by the British Library. And first off, this is just a wonderful production. These books are hardcover. You see the embossed front, really, really beautiful cover. And then the paper is so thick. The paper is like luscious to read from. Like, it just feels really nice on the hand. It's quite heavy, though, as a result. This is, again, around 24 short stories. And they are from all different Celtic cultures and countries. And so there are 3 stories from Scotland, 3 from Ireland, 3 from Brittany, 3 from Isle of Man, 3 from Wales, 3 from Cornwall, and then 3 stories that were originally written in Gaelic and translated into English. I had a really great time with this collection. I will say the subtitle, Wicked Folklore and Dark Mythology, is a little bit of an oversell. I wouldn't really classify most of these stories as folk horror, and I've read traditional folk horror going back to 19th century folk horror, and I understand that there's a transformation of what we consider folk horror in present day versus, what it was 100 years ago or so. Some of these would qualify as, classic folk horror or spooky tales. Others are just folk stories that happen to be from those areas. And so Wicked Folklore and Dark Mythology feels like a really heavy subtitle. I don't think it quite lives up to that, but it's still a really fun collection of short stories. And they range, I think the earliest one is in 1802. The most recent one is in the 1980s. So almost 2 centuries worth of stories. And so this is a really wonderful collection. I do recommend it. It's edited by Johnny Mains. He has another collection, also published by the British Library, called Scotland Strange, or Strange Scotland, one or the other. And those, I believe, are all weird tales just out of Scotland. So I'm hoping to pick that up as well. But Celtic Weird, I do recommend it. Just don't expect a lot of dark folk horror. There are some, but more is just kind of folk stories in general, with a little bit of a dark tint to them. Like, very, very minor. Still a lot of fun, though. So those are the 2 short story collections. Let's jump to the audiobooks I read. And these were hit and miss. That's not true. All of them were good. One was really, really good, and the others were okay. The first one I read was called Lockjaw, and this is by Matteo L. Cirilli. And this is about a small town and what monsters live in a small town. We kind of have 2 stories going on at the same time. We have one small group of young kids who are like the outcasts. And in the very beginning of the story, this is the prologue, so this isn't giving anything away. There's another young boy who's an outcast who kind of is invited to join their gang, and he's going to meet them at the old mill, and he dies, or he's killed. One or the other, it's not really clear. And the kids are insistent that he was taken by a monster, and there is a monster in this town, and this town is haunted and predated upon by a monster, and none of the adults take them seriously, especially the chief of police or the sheriff, who says that especially the young girl who is in charge of this kind of gang of outcasts and her whole family, they, aren't to be trusted. Like, their kind are always getting into trouble. The title Lockjaw is because he says that their whole family is like a bunch of dogs that once they get you in their jaw, they don't let go. And so there is a lot of class and race things that are being explored in this. So these kids are insistent there's a monster, and that if the adults aren't going to do anything about it, then they're going to hunt the monster themselves. That is one storyline. And the other storyline is there's a young man who's coming to town, and he just graduated high school. He's a young trans man who is leaving his family behind. He's not quite running away because he is a young adult. He graduated high school, but he is running away from his old life where he wasn't accepted. And he happens upon this town. He stops there to get gas. He meets this crew of kids, and he kind of decides that this is where he's going to settle down roots. Not really sure why. That is a little ambiguous, but he has nothing to his name except for his dog and his beat up car and whatever money is in his wallet. And so he decides he wants to become part of this town. And so these two stories are kind of interwoven, one in the other, of this young man trying to find himself, who is an outsider to this town, but wanting to fit in, and this group of kids who are outcasts, who are insistent that there's a monster haunting the town and killing people and hurting people, and no one is paying attention to them. And now the story has like a big revolution that happens about 1/3 of the way through that turns the whole story on its head. Like it's a big momentous event in the story, just in the way the narration works. You know something was coming because in that first part, things don't seem to be adding up. Like something feels wrong about the first part of the story. And it feels like there is just something happening underneath the skin that you're missing or that you're not paying attention to. And then you realize, oh no, you were paying attention. The story, the narrative is just kind of intentionally being tricksy. I appreciate that from the author's point of view, wanting to set it up one way and then kind of, shake you a little bit. And I liked where the story went, even though I felt it was a little heavy-handed by the end. But just the way that narration worked and that like rug pull moment, it didn't work for me, I think, the way the author wanted it to. It just felt awkward and it didn't feel balanced between these two. And I don't know how the author, he could have told the story he wanted to tell in the back half without setting up the front half the way he did. So I don't have like a way to fix the situation. But it didn't, the pacing and the writing wasn't strong enough for that kind of big overturn of the story for me. It just didn't feel balanced on both halves. However, I still enjoyed it. I thought the characters were interesting. I thought the questions that it asked about humility and about what it means to be part of a small town and about protecting yourself, standing up for yourself, being an outcast, being invited, wanting to fit in, wanting to know who you are, understand yourself in the midst of people who are trying to judge you for things that are out of your control. Those are all really interesting and important ideas, especially in YA horror novels. So I appreciated it. I enjoyed it. I look forward to reading other books by this author. This one didn't do it for me 100%, but it's definitely worth your time if you are able to stumble upon it. The next book that I read is So Thirsty by Rachel Harrison, and this is a vampire story, a feminist vampire story is how it's sold, and it's not giving anything away. It's in the blurb that the main characters are two young women, or I guess middle-aged, or not middle-aged, in the 30s, mid-30s women, who stumble upon a coven of vampires, and it kind of changes everything about their life. And this, I liked the writing a lot, but everything about this story felt expected. Like there were no surprises in it, and that really was unfortunate to me because I was looking forward to this. I've heard interviews with Rachel Harrison, and I've heard a lot of good things about a number of her books that are all in this kind of feminist horror space. And this one, I heard good things about it, but it just didn't quite live up to them. I mean, the two main characters, our main character is, someone who is very mousy and like unsure of herself and doesn't want to cause any waves. And of course, there's some sort of trauma in her past that caused her to be the way she is now, where she just accepts whatever happens to her and doesn't want to like create a ruckus. Meanwhile, her best friend is the opposite of that wild party girl who is dating a rock star who is traveling through all of Europe. And they both, of course, are the only ones that understand each other, even though they are like, oil and water on the outside. I appreciate that narrative, but it's not interesting. Like they are exactly who you expect them to be. And for her birthday, they go to a spa for the weekend and they end up meeting these vampires. And again, it plays out the way you expect it to play out. And of course, becoming a vampire causes them to reassess what their needs are, what their shame is, what their holdups are, what they're holding themselves back from, how they're reacting to society's expectations and so forth. And is what they really want, if they give in to their thirst and to their hunger and to their needs, is that able to let them realize a more true version of themselves. And it's good. Like the story's written well, the writing is nice, the characters are like well developed, even if they are expected. But just nothing about the story surprised me. Like I knew what was going to happen every step of the way, and the characters were exactly who I expected them to be. And so that was a little disappointing. I don't know if that's from my side or from the book side. It didn't surprise me. The writing was good, the pacing was good, it pulled you along, and it makes me want to read more of Rachel Harrison's work, but this one just didn't work for me 100%. It might for you. I wanted a little bit more surprise to the story. Now, the next thing I read, I had never expected to see an audiobook version of, and this is The Howe by David Sodergren. David Sodergren is a Scottish author who writes splatterpunk/extreme horror. He also writes under the pseudonym of Carl John Lee, who writes splatterpunk as well. And everything he writes is independently published, but he's got a big following. And I didn't anticipate him to have an audiobook, a professionally produced audiobook, but there is one. And I actually looked, and another one of his books is being produced as an audiobook by the same company, and that's going to be coming out later in the year. And so I saw this at my library, and so I grabbed it, and it is great. This story is folk horror meets eldritch horror meets a romance on the beach in a small village in Scotland. Our main character is an 84-year-old woman, and she lives in this small village where she's lived her whole life with her fisherman of a husband who died 12 years ago. And at this point, there is a billionaire in America who is buying up the whole village to create a golf course. And he's already forced out almost everyone from the village, and there's only, a half dozen households or cottages, essentially, who are refusing to sell their land. And awful things start happening to them. They start mysteriously disappearing. And our main character, this woman, refuses to give in to this foreigner. And she finds something on the beach, let's say, that aids her in her quest to maintain her home. And this story, like I said, it has this really heartwarming romance at the heart of it. It's also graphic and violent and disturbing, and all sorts of bodily fluids are leaking out in all sorts of disturbing ways. It's definitely extreme in that regard. It isn't as extreme as other books I've read by this author, but it doesn't, pull any of his punches. It was really wonderful to read, and it was really wonderful to read in this format. I really enjoyed it. There's a juxtaposition of what are actually sweet, heartwarming story at the center, and then the violence that surrounds it, and just hearing it narrated in such like a straightforward way. The writing is strong. It's a really short book. It's less than 200 pages. It's great. So I definitely recommend The Howe by David Sodergren, and if you can get the audiobook version, it was a pleasure to read in that format. And then the last audiobook that I read this month, and I just finished it today, is The Vampires of El Norte. This is by Isabel Cañas. This is her second book. Her first book was The Hacienda, which I didn't read. This one I enjoyed. It wasn't quite as much as I wanted it to be. So this takes place in the mid-19th century in Mexico, before or during different American colonizing attempts at taking over different parts of Mexico. It starts when our main character is 13. There are two main characters, and they're 13, and then there's a time jump of 9 years. And I'm not giving anything away by explaining. This is all part of the marketing copy. So the main character, one of them is the daughter of a wealthy landowner, and the other one is the nephew who lives on that land as one of the basically indentured workers, the farmhands who live on this land, almost like a feudal fiefdom that happened in 19th century Mexico. And the story combines this gothic horror, with this almost pastoral romantic modality of writing. And so it's this combination of pastoral gothic horror with a romance at its heart. And I appreciate that balance. The way it starts, these two kids, they're attacked by a vampire, and he thinks that she dies, so he runs away. And then you cut to 9 years later when you find out she didn't die, and he has to go back because there are militias that are being formed to supplement the Mexican army to help fight the Yankees, who are coming and trying to take over the farms and take over the land. And so he goes back and realizes she's alive, and they have feelings, right? All sorts of feelings for each other. Meanwhile, there are vampires, and the vampires are these feral beasts that they don't know why they're there. No one really knows that they're vampires. They kind of sneak in and out. There isn't a lot of folklore about them, so they're kind of like on the periphery of the story. Now, I'll say that the writing is beautiful. The writing is lush and poetic. There's lots of descriptive metaphor and simile, but it never feels heavy-handed. It really feels emotional, and it brings you into a sense of place really strongly. I think the atmosphere and the world building is really, really well done in this book. And the characters are kind of boilerplate, like they're what you'd expect them to be. She is headstrong and rebellious and wants to be her own woman, even though, it's middle of the 1800s. And she is the daughter of a wealthy landowner, so she has all these social expectations that she's trying to fight against, yet she still loves her father and her family. And he is all machismo and like a real man's man, ranchero, and, a cowboy kind of guy, yet he's also gentle at heart and very loving and kind and sensitive. So they're what you'd expect them to be in this kind of romance. The chapters go back and forth between these two characters from their points of view. And the pacing is really well done. What didn't work for me is it didn't lean into the horror that much or into the romance that much. It tried to do both. And because of trying to do both, it felt a little bit empty. If you really wanted to lean into the horror, then it could have done that. It could have given us more mythology. It could have given us more with these vampires who are just kind of on the periphery. You know, they are a plot point. They aren't a central part of the story. They're just there, but they're not that important. And so it could have done that if it really wanted to lean into the horror. Or if it didn't want to lean into the horror, if it wanted to lean into this pastoral romance, then it could have gone more in that direction and been surprising and interesting. But what we had there is these two star-crossed lovers, essentially. Like, they became infatuated with each other, even though due to their different statuses and statures in life, they were never allowed to be together because he is obviously a worker and she is of the, landowning class. So it's just, I don't know, it was what you'd expect it to be. There was no surprises. And the writing really carried it through. The writing almost reminded me of Victor Lavelle a little bit. Like, it was just really lush and beautiful, and the prose was somewhat poetic in many places. I just wanted more of either the horror or more of this pastoral romance that was somewhat more surprising and exciting. Instead, it tried to walk the line between the two of them, and by doing that, I wasn't satisfied with either of them. However, I really enjoyed the writing, I enjoyed the world building, and I just enjoyed the way the story told itself, if that makes sense. So I do look forward to reading another book by her. Actually, has another book coming out this year, which is about a possession story, I think. And so I'm looking forward to reading that. I think there's a lot of potential there. I just think she needed to be more confident in either one of her storylines instead of trying to walk the line between both of them. Because by doing that, the book didn't feel like it committed to either one in any meaningful way. So I was a little bit disappointed, but I still enjoyed it. And I definitely look forward to reading more from her. So those are the audiobooks I read. So let's get into the other books I read. So I read, the first book is Shroud by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I did a buddy read of this with Alex from Alex on a Bridge, and I actually have a full review of this coming up soon. So I won't say too much about it here, except that it is a sci-fi horror novel. It is his newest novel. I don't think it's released in the US yet. It just came out in the UK in February, and it is a survivalist horror that is set on a desolate planet that is being strip mined for parts, thanks to capitalism and greed, basically. And a couple of workers get stranded on this planet, which is totally different than anything where, as humans, we could expect from any planet. There's no ability to understand any of the fauna or flora on this planet. And so they need to survive this planet and get back to, the main ship. And that is the whole pretense of the story. I thought it was great. It doesn't have as much kind of wit and dry humor as the other books by Tchaikovsky that I've read, but it is there, especially because some of the chapters are from the point of view of these alien life forms that are on the planet. And when you get to hear their point of view and their voice, you do get some of this sardonic wit coming in. A lot of it before then is more descriptive. It doesn't have that same level of wit. And some of the character work happens a little bit off the page. So you don't see as much character development as I would have liked. When you get to the end of the story, you realize there's been some character development, but it wasn't as explicit as they're trying to survive this alien world. However, the world itself, the world building and the world they landed on, and the aliens that they're interacting with are so incredibly well rendered, and it's so immersive and so smart, and I just wanted to spend more and more time with this book. So I had a really great time with it. I really, really enjoyed it. And like I said, I have a full review coming up soon. Then next, I did read one advanced reader copy in the last 2 weeks, and that is Bat Eater and Other Names for Corazon by Kylie Lee Baker. This I enjoyed quite a lot. It took a while to get into it. It's set during the COVID pandemic in New York, and at first I was curious as to if that needed to be the case, and I bristled a little bit because the things it's exploring ideas of racism, essentially, and of who gets forgotten and who gets remembered. It feels like that kind of those explorations of discrimination and so forth could happen outside of the specific COVID environment. And I wondered if someone who didn't have any sort of experience of what New York City was like during the COVID pandemic would get the same amount of world building just going into it as someone who does have that experience. So that the verdict is a little bit out, because the world building is really immersive and almost claustrophobic, but that's because I have that experience. I know what New York City was like. I've seen the videos and the pictures, and I lived through it, not in New York, but other places. So it worked for me in that way. I wonder if it would work as effectively with someone who doesn't have that experience. So that I'm not sure about, but the story itself follows a young woman named Cora, who's Chinese American, who is working for a company that does crime scene cleanup. And she's discovering that a lot of these crimes that she's cleaning up are Asian women who are being brutally murdered. And it seems like by a serial killer, because there's a bat that is left at a lot of these murders. And of course, bat eater being a derogatory term that was used during the COVID pandemic, specifically against Chinese Americans and Chinese people in general, but really due to ignorant bigots in America to all Asian people. So her and her friends, who are part of this cleanup crew, are trying to investigate who is a serial killer, who is killing these Asian women, because no one else cares about it. They can't get any interest from any authorities. Now, at the same time, so that's one storyline. At the same time, there's a storyline that it is the month of the Hungry Ghost celebration. So part of Chinese folklore, and when Buddhism came to China and mixed with other Chinese beliefs and systems, the way they interpret ancestor worship and hungry ghosts, and they celebrate hungry ghosts, is it has to do hungry ghosts being these supernatural beings who represent like the spirits of your ancestors, who for some reason they're not fulfilled and they will haunt you. And during 1 month a year, you make all these offerings to them to try to appease them so that they can find their way to another future rebirth and not be either haunting you or anyone else. And there seem to be these supernatural entities that are haunting Cora, whether it's one entity or more than one entity, whether it's Hungry Ghost or something else. She seems to be haunted and also hunted. And so she's trying to deal with this supernatural threat and this real world threat at the same time and see if those two intersect or not. And I really enjoyed the way those two played out against each other. So I thought the story was really smart and I had a good time with it. I do wonder a little bit about the setting. In the end, I feel like it was useful. I just wonder if you don't have that experience going in, if it'll be as meaningful, which is kind of a moot point for anyone reading it now. But, in 10 years or 15 years, I do wonder if it's still going to hold up. But I did enjoy it, and I have a full review coming out closer to its publication date, which will be, I think, at the end of March. Then, only a few more books. I reread Carrie by Stephen King, and this is Stephen King's first published novel. It's his 5th novel that he wrote, and I had forgotten how much I like this novel. I also had forgotten how short it is and how much epistolary matter is in this novel. When he wrote this novel, he was working as an English teacher. He had just graduated from college. He had 2 kids, and he was barely making enough to make ends meet. And short stories that he was selling to magazines were what were allowing him and his wife Tabitha to basically be above the poverty line. And he started writing this story, and he realized that it couldn't be a short story, and it kind of got out of control. So he threw it away. He said it wasn't worth pursuing because he needed to be writing short stories in order to, pay the bills. But Tabitha took it out of the garbage and read it, his wife Tabitha, and said, no, you should continue with this. I want to see how it ends. So that's like the mythology behind Carrie. And so he did, and lo and behold, he is, king of American horror now. And this is the book that really got him started. However, as you read it, it's very clear that it is a short story that got out of control. There is, like I said, all this epistolary material that is put in. And, if you read a lot of fantasy, especially, a lot of fantasy will have like epigraphs before every chapter that gives some sort of background or some sort of forecasting what's going to happen in that chapter, or giving background history, giving something. It feels like a number of epigraphs, though there aren't any chapter breaks. There's just 3 breaks in the sections, and the last section is really just the last 10 pages. Then the beginning of it is broken into 2 halves, basically before the prom and after the prom. But it has all these little epistolary things. Some of them are excerpts from newspaper headlines. Some of them are excerpts from articles and academic research papers written about Carrie White and about the incident. And you see so many hallmarks of King right in this novel. And, I know this is not his first novel, but all the novels he wrote before this are all Bachman books. Those are much more cynical. They're much angrier. This is his first novel where you really see King identifying as the Stephen King we know, and the things that he grew into as he matured and as his writing got better. One of the things you see right from the beginning is that Stephen King does not like bullies. He despises bullies, which is why in a lot of his books you see anyone that is abusing their power, especially police officers or religious people, or anyone else that has, or politicians, anyone that has his position of power and is abusing it, those are often his biggest villains, because he doesn't like bullies. But at the same time, he recognizes that quite often those bullies come from some sort of traumatic past, that they're not sui generis, they don't come from anything. So he has this compassion for the bullies, even though they're the ones that he can't tolerate at all. And so he never makes anything black and white. He always, or not always, but usually his characters, even the ones that you can tell he doesn't root for, are complicated. And then on top of that, you see this commitment to the shame you have of not standing up in the face of others being bullied isn't enough to obviate the violence you yourself perpetuated by saying nothing. That you as a bystander are engaging in acts of violence, and being ashamed of that isn't good enough. All of that you see in this story. And it's so short. So I really recommend everyone read Carrie by Stephen King. I read it as part of my ongoing Buddhist Path in Fiction project, where I'm looking through different works of Stephen King and engaging in the kind of deep or intimate reading style that I try to read with all the fiction I read, and use Stephen King as an example of how I try to find philosophical or soteriological ideas in unlikely places. So there'll be a longer video coming out on Carrie, hopefully soon. Now, the last 2 books I read this month, I read The Mad Ship by Robin Howe. This is the second book in the Live Ship Trader trilogy, which follows the Farseer trilogy as part of the Realm of the Elderlings, the 16-book saga. And I loved this book. I'm really loving this trilogy. This is Robin Howe showing that she can do epic fantasy at a much bigger scale than anyone would have expected just reading the Farseer trilogy. The Farseer trilogy is focused on one character, and it's all written in this first-person narration. And I actually have a review of that whole trilogy coming out soon, so I talk more about it there. In the Live Ship Traders, she has at least a half a dozen different characters, and the story itself, on one hand, is still kind of small. It's really a story about a single family, but that family is spreading out all over the world. And I think it's really, really beautifully done. And what's also really exciting is you don't actually have to read the Farseer trilogy to read this trilogy. Like, it stands alone. It's set in the same world, but a different part of the world. Yet, by reading this, it questions a lot of the world building and the mythology that you came to accept in the Farseer trilogy, because those were our narrators. Now it's saying, what if those narrators were wrong? What they believed about the world isn't exactly what you thought it was, or what they thought it was. So I really appreciate that. And so there's one more book in this trilogy, but after that, the next trilogy, I think it's the Tawny Man trilogy, it's called, and that goes back to the same character as the Farseer trilogy. So I'm excited to get back to him and see how his world has changed, especially with this new information about the world that I'm getting from Live Ship Traders. So I'm having a blast with it. They are all big. Every book in the trilogy is 900 pages, so they are beefy, but they're worth it. They fly by. The writing is really, really evocative, and it feels controlled, even though, she does go on. And there's no stagnation. You're always moving. So I really enjoyed this book quite a lot. And what it got me thinking about is, it got me thinking to the next book. And the reason is, there are some characters in this book, a number of them, who have these goals in mind that they want to reach. And in order to reach those goals, they're putting on a performance. They're pretending to be someone they aren't. And because they realize that by putting on that performance, they'll be able to manipulate others in one way or another to try to achieve their ends. And as I see them doing this manipulation, you're inside their head, so you see them thinking one thing but doing something else. And it seems like the more they perform to be this other kind of person, they're slowly becoming that person. So I'm wondering if in the next book, that line between performance and identity gets blurred. And what that got me thinking of is Mother Night by Kurt Vonnegut. So this is the final book that I read the last half of the month. Now, I've read this book twice, I think, and I had made a commitment or a goal of rereading all of Kurt Vonnegut's book in 2025, and I just haven't done it yet. So this is the first one I picked up this year. I hope to read the rest of them. I've only read about a half dozen of Kurt Vonnegut's books, and I read those when I was in high school and college, so it's been decades. But this is one of my favorites. The reason I thought about it when looking at the characters in The Mad Ship is because right in the beginning of this story, in his introduction, Kurt Vonnegut says, "This is the only story of mine whose moral I know. I don't think it's a marvelous moral. I simply happen to know what it is. We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be." And this story is written as a confession. Actually, Vonnegut lists himself as the editor, and Howard Campbell is the author of this confession of someone who committed war crimes, and he is on trial in Israel for war crimes against humanity because he was an American living in Germany who was engaging in Nazi propaganda. He was one of the chief officers of propaganda for the Nazi Party, and he had a nightly radio broadcast. What you find out, though, is that before he joined the Nazi Party, he was recruited by an American government agent to act as a spy. And the reason he was engaging in these nightly broadcasts was because he was given secret codes that, he had to cough in a certain place or insert a certain number of pauses in his speech. And by doing that, he was communicating critical information to higher ups in the American government. And so he was serving as a good American. But the way he did it was by acting as the leader of the Nazi propaganda machine. And there are a number of Nazi officers and soldiers who came up to him throughout the whole war saying, if it weren't for your broadcast, I wouldn't have been able to go on. I wouldn't have been able to fight this fight and recognize the wonderful goals of the Nazi regime if it hadn't been for you. You single-handedly made this war possible for me. So he has these dual identities. And the whole book is written about, is a confession from him about what it means and what does evil look like, and is there a difference between an evil intention and an evil person, and where can that line be drawn, and what does complicity look like, and just considering the state of the world right now, I think this book is incredibly poignant to read in 2025, and it should be assigned reading for everyone. It's so beautiful. His satire, Kurt Vonnegut's satire, is so dark and like so on point and so uncompromising that you as a reader feel complicit immediately. It's examining, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be honest with yourself? What does it mean to participate in activities that you may not agree with, but you think you have to for one reason or another? And what does it mean to be a person who's living in a world during difficult times, who has the free will to make choices that affect others? How does making those choices change who you are as a person? It's really short, less than 200 pages. I highly, highly recommend it. It's a great book, and I'm glad that I'm back into Vonnegut. I had this goal of reading a lot of Vonnegut's work this year, and I was inspired by some of the characters in Robin Hobb's story, so I'm glad I picked it up. And that is the last of the books I read. So that was quite a lot of books that I read in the back half of March. I don't really have a whole lot of plans for April. As I said, the monastery is picking back up. I don't want to have too extensive of plans. I do have a few buddy reads lined up. The first one is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This I'm reading with Pat from Book Chat with Pat. She and I have been talking about this for months. I think we planned this in January, but both of our schedules are so busy, we haven't had a chance to do it. So we planned it for April. And I believe that the Futurian Fellowship is also reading this book in April. So there's a whole lot of people reading this book this month, and I'm really excited to get to it. I've been reading more and more Adrian Tchaikovsky in the last couple months and loving everything I read by him. So that is my first buddy read of the month. And then I'm also buddy reading Imago by Octavia Butler. This is the final book in the Xenogenesis trilogy, and I'm reading this with Carl from Please Read Your Book. The first book is called Dawn. The second book is Adulthood Rights, and we just had an hour-long conversation about adulthood rights. That video is on my channel, and we previously had a conversation about Dawn. That video is on his channel. If you've read these books, I definitely recommend watching those videos. It was a great conversation. It is full spoilers, so if you haven't read these books and you're planning on it, then maybe you should read them first, but they're really easy to read. The writing is so strong and compelling, and they're both short. They're less than 300 pages, all three of them. This is the shortest one, actually, I believe, and it takes place basically 250 years in the future after there's been a nuclear apocalypse, and aliens have managed to save a number of humans. And now that Earth has gotten to a place where it can be repopulated, they are helping repopulate Earth with these aliens with these humans that they saved. But they're only going to do it on the condition that they alter the human genome, and they basically interbreed with these humans. So it's asking all these interesting questions about humanity and what it means to be a person, but also these questions about gender, because the aliens have 3 genders, they don't have 2, and you need all 3 genders if you hope to reproduce. And so in order for humans to reproduce, they need to actually have all 3 genders as part of the biology. That's part of the genetic manipulation that the aliens are doing. And, you know, these books are written in the 80s, but they feel relevant right now. And they're really easy to read. They're really fun. So I'm looking forward to reading Imago. That's the last book in the trilogy. But I highly recommend the whole trilogy. And once you've read them, go check out my discussion with Carl about them. And the only other book I have planned for this month, definite, is The Ship of Destiny. This is the last book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy. And so after this, of course, there's still another 10 books in the realm of the Elderling saga, but I'm really looking forward to this, especially after the last one. And, you know, again, these are all big books, but they read really quickly, much more quickly than their page count would suggest, because just the writing is so crisp. And so I'm looking forward to this. Now, April, there are a couple reading events happening in April. One is Old School April, and one is People April. People April is you're reading biographies and other books about people, hence the name. And Old School April, also pretty self-explanatory. I don't have any commitments for either of these reading events. I do have some books that have been on my ever-growing TBR, so I might dip into those reading events. We'll see how it goes. And I also do have a couple of advanced reader copies that are for the months of March and April, and these are from some authors that I really enjoy, like Caitlin Starling, Mira Grant, David Demchik, Chuck Quendig. So I'm looking forward to reading some of those books as well in the sci-fi horror space. And that are my only plans. I'm trying not to have any strict plans because, like I said, everything at the monastery is starting up again. Because of that, I know my reading is going to go down. It's just busy, you know. We have class 6 days a week, twice a day, and that's our general class. Then there's, you know, between 4 to 8 private classes a week. Then I teach classes, and then of course there is all the prep work, and hours upon hours upon hours of reading and preparation to actually have material to understand to go to class with. And then, I do extracurricular work in my translations, and I'm teaching in Bangalore. And so I have so many things going on that I don't imagine I'm going to have as much time to read. And then on top of that, as much time to make videos going forward. So I don't know what it's going to look like. I'm hoping that my new love for audiobooks is going to help supplement, and we'll see. I'd love to know what kind of videos folks are most interested in. I'm going to keep doing reviews, especially for advanced reader copies and for trilogies and series, because those are the ones I enjoy doing most. But as far as other types of videos, these wrap-up videos I enjoy doing. I don't know how much people enjoy them. The videos I enjoy most, though, I can't really plan. So, for instance, I just did a video, I think last week, that was about what it means to find truth in fiction. And I was motivated to make that video after reading The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, something she wrote in her introduction, made me want to make that video. But that wasn't planned. I just read that and I was inspired to make a video. So I can't, set a schedule to when I'm going to be inspired to make videos like that. So those are the videos I enjoy most doing, but they're also the most nebulous. The ones I can't plan out, they just happen. And this long-term project of the Buddhist path in fiction is also like a big ongoing project. But aside from those things, I can't really plan for what is going to be on the channel. So if there's specific things that people find more engaging or interesting than others, how I can contribute to this community in an uncommon way, that's what I want to be doing, and spending my time focused on that kind of video instead of wrap-ups or things that people are less interested in, since my time is going to be more limited in at least the next few months while I transition into being full-time again at the monastery. So if you have any thoughts about that, I would love to hear them down below. What kind of videos are you most interested in? Is it okay if they're sporadic because they're going to be waiting on my inspiration and I'm not going to be able to plan them out ahead of time? Do you like these wrap-ups, especially when they go on? They're so long. Look at how long this one is, and that's only for 2 weeks. Let me know what kind of things you enjoy watching and how you think my participation in this community, I can offer something uncommon. That way I can focus my time on, creating those kind of things that are more interesting to people. Anyway, yeah, anything you have for thoughts about that, I'd love to hear them down in the comments. If you have any ideas about any of the books I mentioned, or any ideas about things that might be fun to read by any of the authors I mentioned, I'd love to hear all your thoughts, ideas, suggestions, recommendations down in the comments. But for now, I'm going to say thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.